draft legislation coming out of the Sustainable Columbus office. I'm Councilmember Emmanuel Remy, and I chair the Environment Committee. Co-hosting today's hearing is Councilmember Rob Dorans, chair of the Building and Zoning Policy Committee. I want to remind everyone that this hearing is currently live on YouTube and Facebook, and is also live and being recorded for rebroadcast on CTV, Columbus's government television channel 3. The rebroadcast schedule is available at www.columbus.gov. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I certainly want to thank my colleague and co-host, Councilmember Rob Dorans, for being here, and I'd like to offer an opportunity to say a few words.
Sounds like we've got a game going on here. No, thank you, Chair Remy. Appreciate folks' attention on this important issue. Excited to hear and talk about the legislation, and certainly hear from members of the community about their comments on this, because as we know, this emerging marketplace, we have a chance to get things right in the front end to make sure that we're being thoughtful about all the things we want to be, whether or not that's making sure that the equity arguments that are clearly baked into this work, as well with associated workforce issues. So thank you to Chair Remy. I appreciate the time to be here tonight.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Dorans, and want to welcome our presenters today. We have Anthony Celebrezzi, the Deputy Director of Office of Building and Zoning Services, Brian Clark, the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Department of Public Utilities, and Jenna Topoldi, Climate Advisor for the Department of Public Utilities. The City of Columbus has ambitious goals to address the impacts of climate change and tackle environmental racism. Through mayoral and city council leadership, Columbus adopted our first ever climate action plan, and we're taking thoughtful steps to implement the actions outlined within. This has included the development and implementation of an urban forestry master plan, solar co-ops, litter and illegal dumping mitigation, energy benchmarking, and more. Transportation in Columbus, largely from gas-powered cars, contribute to 38% of our community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. Transitioning gas-powered cars to electric cars is a critical step to reduce our emissions and ensure clearer air throughout our community and in our neighborhoods. To support the EV transition and meet our climate action plan goals, the city is working to increase the number of electric vehicle charging stations and expand access to electric vehicle chargers, particularly for residents in multifamily housing and in our opportunity areas. To meet the goal, the city began exploring with the adoption of the Equitable Electric Vehicle Readiness Parking Ordinance, what it could mean in Columbus. EV-ready parking ordinances are a best practice in peer cities and have been adopted by over 24 cities and states. They ensure that newly constructed parking lots and garages have a minimum number of EV charging stations installed upon completion of construction, and have the ability to easily and affordably add EV charging stations in the future. The Sustainable Columbus team began this effort with resident and community engagement, teaming up with 2 local partners, ComIn Strategies and Impact Community Action, to deeply engage with our residents. Through their efforts, 600 residents from opportunity neighborhoods have been engaged. Building on resident and community engagement, Columbus held 6 90-minute meetings with the building industry, community-based organizations, developers, the affordable housing sector, local utilities, and other related stakeholders to co-create an equitable EV-ready parking ordinance. The draft EV-ready parking ordinance before us today is reflective of input from our residents, community-based organizations, developers, the building industry, environmental organizations, and our local utility companies. It was created through an iterative process, making amendments throughout in the Columbus way. Today, we will hear a presentation from the Sustainable Columbus team to learn more about the efforts made to make this a collaborative public-private partnership-driven process. Details within the draft legislation and changes already made to the legislation through these conversations. We will then hear from invited city partners to share more about the process, and finally, we will end with public testimony. All right, with that, I will turn the floor over to our presenters. First up, we have Anthony Celebrezzi, from Deputy Director of the Office of Building and Zoning Services. And Deputy Director Celebrezzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Council Member. I believe that Jenna Topaldi will go ahead and kick off our presentation. If Lucy could patch her in.
Thanks, Tony. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Seeing a head nod in the distance. If you all can see the screen share, Tony, I'll hand it to you to get things started with the presentation.
Say that again, Jenna. So.
Can you all see the screen share?
Yep, we got it.
Awesome.
Okay, so the presentation, as you said, Council Member, by Brian, Jenna, and myself, basically we'll cover 4 areas. What is EV-ready parking? What is, why is it important? And then the equitable policy, the co-creation process that you mentioned, and then we'll cover what the EV-ready parking in Columbus will look like. So, so EV-ready parking, there are 3 levels of readiness for this that we are talking about. There's EV-capable, EV-ready, and actual EV installed. EV-capable, which is the most basic, that is installing the capacity and running the conduit to parking spaces without providing a plug or a charger. That is obviously wanting to be proactive when a parking lot is set up and maybe the need is not quite as great as it may be in the future. EV ready is you run the wire through the conduit and provide a plug that would allow a trickle charge at the other end. And then EV installed, which would be actually installing of a level 2 EV charger station at the parking place. So I'll break these down a little bit further. The EV capable, back to the most basic, it enables an easy and affordable expansion in the future. We found, and I'm sure Jenna and both Brian will speak to this also later on, but the heavy costs come when you try to retrofit parking lots, when you're trying to either bore or cut into it. So part of the EV capable formula later on that we'll discuss places that conduit in a newly installed parking lot prior to it being paved over so that there is access for those spaces. And that essentially is two pieces. It's the conduit and then also making sure there's space at the panel when they are building that parking lot, because there's almost all parking lots have electric running to them to begin with for lighting and other issues. So let's EV ready, which is the middle category. This really only applies to 1, 2, and 3 family units, and this runs not only puts in the conduit, but it runs the wiring and ends in what most people typically call the dryer plug. Basically, it's a NEMA socket. So someone could plug in and do a trickle charge at their house with this type of with EV ready. And that's requiring panel space and conduit like in the EV capable, and then actually running the wire and ending in a socket that someone can use the onboard charger for their car to trickle charge overnight. And again, that's for the 1, 2, and 3 family. The EV installed is where you actually install the charger, the level 2 charger, and that provides a quicker and faster charge than the trickle charge. It's not a fast charger. So that's a level 3. So the EV installed, it combines everything from capable and ready, and then adds the actual charger for it, so that you can charge your car whether it's in your house or whether it's at a commercial location. So, all right. So why is EV-ready parking important? Jenna, Brian, going to run through that?
Yes, sir, if that's all right.
Excellent. I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Chair Remy, Councilmember Dorans, for having us today. There's a lot to unpack on this slide. Everyone loves an Excel spreadsheet, me included, so we'll spend a couple of minutes on this. I want to first ground us with a few things that we consider foundational with Sustainable Columbus. The first is that climate change is real, that humans are causing it, but we can do something to both adapt to and mitigate climate change. The second key thing for us is that we know where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. So essentially in the city of Columbus, we know where the problem is. The first number there, 11 million, that's the metric tons of greenhouse gases that we emitted in our most recent inventory for the city of Columbus. You'll see that transportation accounts for the vast majority, that plus buildings equals 80% of our greenhouse gases. There is also a cost associated with those greenhouse gas emissions. For the past 14 years, the federal government has used a social cost of carbon formula that has been updated iteratively by an intergovernmental working group. It has been tested by courts. It is the gold standard for federal rulemaking, and making sure that we take into account the fact that every metric ton of carbon that we emit has a cost to our society. And what we can see here is the cost of no action on EV transition in the city of Columbus. That would mean adding an additional 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's on the low end, an additional $12 million in cost to our residents. On the high end, $130 million in cost. So what are the costs we're talking about here? We're talking about property damage because of inclement weather. We are talking about adverse health outcomes. We're talking about disruption of energy systems. All the things that climate change can do that can disrupt and harm our lives. And this puts a price on that. But what we see is that by transitioning to a 15% adoption rate, and that's what we're proposing in our climate action plan, we'll actually be able to save our community money. This program, this policy, will actually have a positive impact on people's health and on the well-being of their property and their families. So in looking at this greenhouse gas emission impact between now and 2030, which is when we have that put together, if we take no action, if we let the market dictate where we're going to head on this, we will add $43 million in new carbon cost to our community. If, however, we're serious about the EV transition and use tools like the EV Readiness Ordinance, we'll be able to save a net $13 million between now and 2030. So what are the community-wide benefits? Why is this impactful? So again, remember that for our greenhouse gas emissions and, importantly, other air quality emissions, most of those are coming from single occupant passenger vehicles. When we expand our charging infrastructure, we also increase equitable access and affordability, making sure that opportunity neighborhoods are not left behind yet again in public policy and in investment. We provide access to a lower cost of transportation. Owning and operating an EV is much cheaper than a gas-powered vehicle. We'll avoid some pretty steep retrofit costs in the future. We'll have cleaner air and improved health for our neighborhoods. So, one question that we were asked several times during this process is, are you sure it's going to be EVs? How can you be certain? Every major car manufacturer, with the exception of two, has already set a goal of all or most of their products being converted to EVs no later than 2040. Most of them are by 2035. The two holdouts are also still entering the EV market. Every major national consultant that looks at ESG financing has predicted a significant adoption between now and 2030. And the consensus is that by 2035, EVs will exceed internal combustion engines in sales. I will note that date keeps getting pushed up. So that's not something that, it's actually going to be 2040. It's actually going to happen faster than we thought it would. So we know EVs are good. We know they're coming. what kind of charger capacity do we need to meet that demand? So if we hit our 15% market adoption rate, we will need essentially 20,522 level 2 chargers to meet that charging need. You can see where we are today. You can see where we need to be. There's a significant shortfall. We need to get active both in terms of our own public infrastructure, but also making sure that the private infrastructure is there to serve this need. We started this process, and Chair Remy called it out very well. This is about equity and affordability. And it's not just for homeowners. A lot of times when people think of EVs, they think of Teslas. There are more cost-effective options, and they tend to think of a person living in a single-family home and the person owning that home. But what we know about our city is approximately 50% of our residents are renters. In any given year, upwards of 20% of our residents will move. So we're a very young, dynamic, and fluid city. Renters don't have the ability to do a retrofit for an EV charger. That would require something, really an investment on the part of the property owner for multifamily, and for single family approval from the owner of that property to make that investment. More importantly, the retrofit costs are very high, and there are very few folks that would be willing to make that type of investment in a property that they don't own as a renter. If we don't get this right and get it right now, what we're essentially doing is guaranteeing rent increases and cost increases for renters in the future, as we see multifamily and single family paying significantly more to retrofit for EV charging. And then for homeowner affordability, this is also key. Really, the choice is, do you add an extra dryer plug when you build the house and do that for a very minimal price and the total cost of constructing that home? Or do we force someone to expend upwards of 100% more in funding to do this on their own in the future? That's something that especially with folks that are struggling to meet rent and struggling to meet mortgages, that's one additional cost that they are likely not able to meet. Again, we either get it right now or we bake in inequity for these folks in the future. So we also know that access to EVs reduces transportation costs. This is not going to surprise anyone, but gas prices have gone up 71% since June of last year. It feels like it's a lot more than that. They are projected, and this is prior to COVID and prior to the war in Ukraine, they were already projected to rise year over year for the next 30 years. So there is no relief in sight based on the federal pro formas for gas prices. Electricity, on the other hand, is projected to decline in cost year over the next 30 years, especially as we transition to homegrown renewable energy that is not subject to the whims of a natural gas, coal, or oil commodities market. And then total cost of ownership. While some EVs are certainly more expensive on the front end, they are much cheaper to own and to operate than a regular gas-powered engine. We have an example here of a Nissan Versa versus a Nissan Leaf, and again, you can see that total cost of ownership savings is substantial. So, what are the actual costs? We started this project reaching out to developers, reaching out to national experts, really doing our homework to make sure that we understood what the cost would likely be during construction versus retrofits. We offer this as illustrative costs. There are going to be costs that are higher and lower. And we also offer it with the understanding that COVID and the war in Ukraine, other factors, have caused pretty significant supply chain issues that I think we all hope will be clearing up by the time a policy like this goes into effect. But to give you a sense of the estimated cost for commercial and multifamily, on the very low end for EV capable, we saw costs as low as $210 to meet that EV capable expectation, as high as $840 for that same thing, And again, these are looking at costs both in peer cities, here in the city of Columbus, and in national reports that are available using different methodologies and different sources. If you do that same thing as a retrofit, you're increasing your costs 83 to 85%. If you install a charger, you'll see, first of all, there's going to be a big difference in cost between a networked and a non-networked charger. There is no requirement that chargers be networked in any of our policy discussions. You'll see there that your savings could be as low as 16% if you went with a very high-end network charger, but as high as 49% over the retrofit cost over the cost during construction. We also see that for single-family home construction, the estimates that we received were between $50 and $300. We are continuing to work with single-family home contractors to make sure that we've got the best available data here, but I will say that we're seeing significant alignment with this cost in our peer cities and in all of the national reports that we've looked into. The cost of retrofit, again, much higher, 78 to 80% higher if you retrofit versus doing this on the front end of construction. We've also made sure that we looked at opportunities to contain cost as part of this policy, and very much appreciate the input from a variety of stakeholders that have helped us get there. So the first thing that we did is eliminate an EV-ready requirement for all buildings except for single family. The second is allowing power sharing for those 40 amp breakers. The third is removing a requirement for EV readiness if new parking is added to existing parking rather than it being true new construction. For affordable housing developments, we have agreed that there would be no charger requirement unless the city provided the funding for those chargers. And then lastly, we increase the number of parking spaces before this triggers the policy. Originally, this would be triggered with one parking space. We're currently recommending that it be triggered by the construction of 10 or more parking spaces. So again, going back to that new construction versus retrofit, this just lays out those same items, and I'll jump to the bottom because that's really where the costs come into play. If you have to dig up a parking lot to lay down conduit and wire for a new charging station, you're looking at between $11,000 and $32,000 just for that removal and repair. So retrofit costs are substantial, and again, we want to make sure that we point out the less we build now, the more we'll have to retrofit in the future, and there will be costs associated with that. And we know that those costs will be passed on to future renters and future lessees in the marketplace. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Jenna.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you, Councilmember Remy and Councilmember Dorans, for holding this hearing and giving us space to present on these items. I will talk through our process to date, how we got to this point, some of our rationale in policy deliberation and policy co-creation. So to start, high-level rationale of how we crafted the proposed ordinance. As Tony and Brian have highlighted, we looked at what the data is that is out there. What are the data inputs that we need to help inform this policy? Looking at current and future projected EV adoption rate, and looking at current and future EV charging needs. We combined that data with stakeholder input and a strong equity lens, feedback from developers, from community-based organizations, through our EV Ready Roundtable series, and feedback throughout the entire 6-month process. And then we took a sharp look at charging at home and at work. 80% of charging happens in these two locations. As you'll see a little bit later in the presentation, this is where we hope to prioritize increasing the number of EV chargers at these two locations. Taking these two pieces of data, we have a proposed ordinance and implementation strategy that is informed by stakeholder input, informed by data, and provides near-term certainty and longer-term flexibility as technology, the market, and data evolve. We started this process early last year. To Brian's point, we did our homework. We talked to other cities that have implemented EV Ready. learned from them on how the development community in their cities have reacted, learned from them on different implementation strategies, cost containment measures. Again, we did studies on current EV charger distribution and best practices that we are seeing in peer cities. We took that information and we started with equitable engagement. So we contracted with 2 local equitable engagement groups, Common Strategies and Impact Community Action. Common Strategies held focus groups with residents in our opportunity neighborhoods to learn about the opportunities that they perceived as it relates to the transition to electric vehicles. And then we started to have one-on-one conversations with stakeholders, including folks from the development community, to talk to them about their charging priorities that they had seen in the last 5 years, where they were seeing trends going in the future, start to talk through what some round details around EV readiness could look like in Columbus to help us prepare for a concerted stakeholder process. We launched that earlier this year. So in launching the EV Ready Roundtable series, we also worked with Impact Community Action to hire 3 community advocates. These are folks from our opportunity neighborhoods who are boots on the ground in community to educate and inform residents about the electric vehicle work that we're doing, Sustainable Columbus programming, and bring the priorities and the needs of community into this process. Those voices were steady throughout our co-creation process meetings, the EV Ready Roundtables that we had starting in January. This slide outlines a little bit of the objectives for each of the 6 meetings. I won't read too much into those, but as you'll see in the front end, we started with identifying what our collective goals were, shared understanding of the task, learn from stakeholders on what their perceived opportunities and barriers related to the electric vehicle transition were. And then we started to discuss different policy approaches, different implementation needs, how we could build on the opportunities that existed and address some of the barriers that existed. And then the second half of the meeting series was an iterative process to look at the different variables that go into an EV ready policy, adjust them based on stakeholder input, understand how data plays in there, how real world market plays in there, and listen, learn, and work with the stakeholders to ensure that what we put forward had their perspectives and their needs and their viewpoints as part of that process. This was an equitable process that was over the course of 4 months. All of the meetings were open to any stakeholder who was interested in joining. We posted the materials online after the sessions. And like we mentioned, stakeholder input was incorporated throughout. Over the course of the EV Ready Roundtable series, we had a number of additional public input opportunities. Like I had mentioned, Common Strategies has held 3 resident focus groups. We had our roundtable meeting series. Through those channels, over 600 residents have engaged. Almost 100% of that number are folks from our opportunity neighborhoods. From the organizational perspective, we have done 2 Sustainable Columbus presentations, 5 presentations to the building industry. The community advocates have been in the community talking to partners at neighborhood associations about the impact of this work, getting their perspective on them. And then we've also had many one-on-one meetings with diverse stakeholders, folks from the development community, community-based organizations, the utility companies, really doing our best to meet people where they are, help them come along to this process and address any questions, concerns, considerations that they had along the way. In the end of April to the middle of May, we held a 30-day public comment period. During this time, the Sustainable Columbus team had 2 informational webinars to educate the community on the proposed policy. And then we also held 2 open office hours where anybody could join onto a virtual meeting, ask us questions, share their feedback, and any concerns and questions cleared up. Any questions, comments that we collected through that process, we also provided written responses to, and a document that outlines all of the feedback we've received, and our responses to that is on our website. Running simultaneously through the 30-day public comment period were also 2 feedback surveys to collect public input. Now that you have a little bit of an idea of the process that we used to get here, I'm going to hand it back to Tony to dig into some details on the proposed ordinance.
Thank you, Jenna. So the proposed amendment to the code would end up being in Title 33, which is the off-street parking and loading section. This section of code is where any design professional that is designing a construction project is going to determine how many parking places they're going to need, how many shade trees, how much lighting and screening around that parking lot. So this is not, will not create a new process. This is just adding to the current review process that Building and Zoning Services goes through and every design professional goes through. So the language, as we said earlier, would be new construction of 10 or more parking places. So it would kick in at that point, the code would read just as, if you're creating 10 or more new parking spaces, then you will need to adhere to this section of the code, and it will spell it out. We made the effective date January 1st of 2024 based upon testimony and comments made from the building industry, many of them working 12 to 14 months out on their plans and how they're doing things. We wanted to make sure that obviously they had enough time to work this into their pro formas and to make sure that they could make it work and knew what was coming. We did not want to we recognize that there's a lot of projects already in their pipeline that they're designing and starting to get ready to submit to us, and we did not want to impact those. We wanted to give them plenty of time to plan for this, to understand what was coming. A couple of things that does not apply to this, and I kind of already alluded to it. With that January 1st, 24 date, the effective date will only impact projects that are actually submitted to the city for review on or after January 2024. So projects that are being currently built will not impact. Projects that are being currently reviewed in our department that haven't turned dirt yet, those will not be impacted also. We also we tried to be more general in our attack with some of the different criteria. We did not feel that it was, we decided to leave it to the developer if they wanted to use a level 2 charger, which is kind of your basic, and you can use a basic non-network charger to install, which is lower cost, versus dictating whether they would use the level 2 or the level 3 fast charger. So that's kind of is left up to the developer in there as they're working through things. So some other requirements, I've already run through what EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed are. And all of these, we made a change actually about a year ago to the zoning code, to this section. All spaces that have these chargers at them will still count towards the minimum number of parking spaces that is required by the rest of the zoning code. So when they come into us and they say they're going to do this particular use, there's different formulas that our zoning folks go through to determine how many parking spaces are needed in a parking lot. So these will not create the need for additional parking spaces beyond what the code currently requires them to do. The only place that we did get specific is when it comes to an ADA space. We put in there that one of these EV charging spaces be located next to the ADA space so that they have equal access to the charger. But as far as any other spaces that they would be required by the code to put in, the applicant has the choice of where they can put it. They can put them anywhere they feel like in the lot. And then due to recent discussions, we're going to make 2 other additional changes, some exemptions. In 1, 2, and 3 unit detached garages that do not have electricity, these would not be mandatory. Again, the developer has not chosen to run electric to it, and so we are not going to require that. The second exemption is for the extremely low income and permanent supportive housing. There's plenty of evidence that vehicles, in many of those cases, are not used. They tend to either be mass transit or not traveling except by specialized vehicles. So those were the 2 exemptions that we recently have changed. The next slide is quite a bit technical, but as I said, we tried to leave things a little bit more general. We're going to leave the technology piece out and leave it to be run through rules and regulations so that we can better react to the market if changes do occur. We do allow 2 spaces to be charged by 140 amp service, which was a change from our original suggestion, and that was based on requests, again, from the building industry. And the same goes for EV ready and EV installed 140 amp breaker or 140 amp service for 2 spaces. It just slows down the charging process a little bit, as opposed to having a dedicated 40 amp for each one. So on the building types, Jenna, if we could jump one more slide. There we go. Thank you. On the building types, we broke down all of the zoning districts into 5 sections. The 1, 2, and 3 family dwellings, and we've listed out there the different, the specific zoning districts that would be impacted. The 4 or more family dwelling and office and workplace rolled together. And let me say one piece with these is the applicant has the option, if they want to charge for the use of charging, they have that option. We do not restrict that. We're leaving that, again, up to the applicant, and there are vendors throughout the country that will come in and actually install this and charge, and it'll be just another contractor that an applicant would engage. So, the 4 or more, there's multifamily, office, healthcare, and a whole list of different uses. Then we broke out what we termed the rest of the commercial, which fall under the C1, 3, 4, and 5 groupings, and which is kind of a wide range of uses. The different uses under the code have different requirements for the amount of parking. And if you do a mixed-use development, our zoning code reviewers are going to look at the different uses that you're doing, residential, office, hotel. They're then going to come up with what each of those sections or each portion of that development that's going to require, for the residential, is going to require a certain number, for office, a different number. And then they're going to total it together and tell the applicant, here's how many parking spaces you need to have. Well, our ratios will follow those numbers. So that it doesn't matter what the use is. The zoning code and its parking ratios are going to dictate how many charging stations we have. Let's see here. So basically, and then the city of Columbus, we are taking a larger portion of it and requiring more of our spaces to be EV ready. And on the next slide, we do put the thresholds out there for the proposed EV readiness. And we originally, as you can see, the EV ready column has a lot of NAs, and that was done because of reaction to input from the community and from the building community, and their concern for having wires sitting in the wall for years before they might actually use it. So we shifted a lot of the EV ready percentages over to EV capable, because that EV capable portion is where the real savings is going to be. Because as I said earlier, cutting up the concrete and trying to retrofit something, that's where your big cost is coming from. The other costs are fairly static as far as when how you do it with putting in the chargers and not having to do that retrofit. So as you can see, family or the 4 or more family, the office and workplace, 30% will be required to be capable, and then they will only need to put 10% actually with an installed charger. For the other commercial that I talked about, which is more of your commercial, your high streets, your retail operations and restaurants, 20% capable with 5% installed. And that's, again, on the total number of required parking spaces, either by code or by variance if they get a parking reduction. Affordable housing is 15% capable, and 5% installed. And then the city of Columbus, is when we put in parking spaces, we will be doing 55% as capable of installing 15% with chargers. And obviously, all these numbers, the capable numbers, are trying to look and be strategic about the future. We know the market is moving in this direction, and so we're trying to be strategic and not play catch up down the road. So the next slide is some of the feedback we received, and I've covered most of these. But again, the lead time, we were concerned with interrupting the processes that the builders are already currently going through. That's why we pushed the implementation date to January 1st of 2024. And then on the technology portion, why we want to leave a number of the technology regulation or technology pieces of the kind of the in the weeds pieces to this, to rules and regulations that we will implement at the department level. And then on down, just trying to look through here to see if I've covered most of this. And then, as I just said, in the EV ready, we made the EV ready category pretty much go away, except for in the 1, 2, and 3 family, because that's going to be your residents, where they're going to be homeowners most likely, and charging in their garage or charging by their house. And then the affordable housing, dealing with the affordable housing, while we understand that margins are smaller on a lot of that, given the cost of materials and so forth, we also didn't want to leave them behind. They've been left behind over the decades with many different pieces of legislation, all under the I think the auspice of that it costs too much and there's not enough margin there. They need to have access to EV charging as much as anyone. The concern over EV charging infrastructure has been, and probably will for the foreseeable future, one of the top 3 reasons why people are reticent to purchase an EV. Is where they're going to charge it, whether they're at home. And as Jenna pointed out, more than 50% of our population are renters, and so for them to try to get a charging station at an apartment, very difficult, would leave them behind also. So at that, Jenna, you can go to the next slide. So at this point, I don't know whether Brian or Jenna, if you have a few comments that you'd like to add here at the tail end.
Good to hand it back to the council members. Thank you, Tony.
Okay.
What was that? She was asking me a question?
Nope. So with that,
back to me. Great. Thanks, Jenna. I appreciate it. Wanted to follow up a little bit on this affordable housing piece to it. I know that you were saying that if they get money from the city, then they wouldn't be exempt. So is that where the requirements on the previous slide, 15% EV capable and 5% level 2 chargers kick in if they do receive money? And when you say receive money, is that CRA money? Like what is constituted as money for affordable housing and not?
Sure. I'm going to let Jenna, if I know that you've worked on that portion of this. So. Yep.
I'm going to pass the buck again to Brian.
The challenge of having 3 people in 3 locations.
I guess there's no one to pass the buck to now, so I'll answer the question. So our Councilmember Remy, that's a great question. Our goal is to make sure that we have fully covered the cost of a EV charger installed, and we're going to be working with council to identify the appropriate funding sources for that payment.
And again, that would be then EV capable. So in one part of in the presentation, it talked about exempt except for when they receive funds. So what my question is, what constitutes them receiving funds from us? Because we have, affordable housing, LIHTC deals that happen throughout. Sometimes we are involved, they're within a CRA, sometimes they're not. Obviously, if they're within a CRA, that constitutes, some sort of an incentive on our part. But those that weren't, they wouldn't be receiving our incentive. They would be receiving LIHTC dollars, but they wouldn't necessarily receive City of Columbus dollars. So I'm just trying to decipher what's the exemption, what's not. And then for those that aren't exempt, again, going back to slide 30, the affordable, is that when that kicks in, the 15% and the 5%?
Thank you for that. So let me definitely clarify my answer. The funding that we're speaking of here would be specific funds that are dedicated to the cost of the charging infrastructure. So it would not include any of the incentives or the 4% LIHTC deals, any of the other things that the city does to support affordable housing. If the city did not provide dedicated funding specific to that charging, and this is for the installed charger, then they would be exempt from the requirement. That only applies currently to the charger itself. It does not apply to the EV capable requirement. The EV capable requirement is a very low cost and something that we felt, at least based on current conversations, would not require additional city funding.
Okay, thank you. Rob, do you have or Councilmember? Okay. That's been my main concern, is just, understanding how those LIHTC deals work and the affordability aspect of it. I just don't want to, we can't build them fast enough. We can't get enough of it in our city, and we certainly don't want to make it a burden in any way, but it sounds like you've got it pretty much under control as far as that goes. All right, I am going to ask, let's see here. Let me just say thank you for the presentation. It's been one that I believe has been very collaborative, and one of the most collaborative that I've seen done by the city. Thankful for the work that the teams put in. I do have a question that came in via Facebook before we go to our guest speakers. Just to get this out of the way, please define level 2. What's the minimum amps, kilowatts charging rate that the city's proposed legislation is requiring? I think that's a defined term that's set nationally, but go ahead and if you could answer that. Brian, can you answer that question?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So what we've done here is place all of those requirements and rules rather than placing it in the ordinance. But in the presentation, you saw that we've adopted the national standards for a level 2 charger. So all of those are spelled out there, including things like the 40 watt. We do allow chargers to share that 40 amp electrical connection. So that's one of the cost containment items that we included there. But again, these are all based on standard national best practices and would be adopted by rules so that as those best practices evolve over time, we're also able to quickly and nimbly respond to those changing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We do have 2 guest speakers to hear from this evening. So first up is Christy Meyer with Smart Columbus. If you'd come to the podium and introduce yourself, happy to receive your testimony. Welcome.
Good evening, Chairman Remy and Chairman Dorans. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you on the Equitable EV Parking Ready Ordinance. My name is Christy Meyer, and I'm the Director of Sustainability for Smart Columbus. I'm here today representing the Columbus Partnership, its members, and Smart Columbus. I come before you in support of the Equitable EV Parking Ready Ordinance. Smart Columbus is an agile, collaborative innovation lab that serves the Columbus region by anticipating and advancing what is new and next at the intersection of technology and community good. Since the city's winning of the U.S. Department of Transportation Smart Cities Challenge in 2016, Smart Columbus has worked to transport our city to the future. EVs are unquestionably in the future, of our city and cities across the country. This transition is essential to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and is already underway with major declarations made by nearly every automotive manufacturer to go fully electric by 2035. This includes our own hometown, Honda, who has committed to being fully electric by 2040. We are fortunate to have a head start in preparing for an electric vehicle dominant future. From 2016 to 2020, the Columbus region saw a 500% increase in EV adoption due in large part to the comprehensive investment in work of the Smart Columbus electrification program. We also saw the addition of 900 charging stations across the region as part of a pilot program by AEP Ohio, in leadership by 100+ developers and local governments. This is just the start. From 2020 to 2021, EV sales grew by 67% in the Central Ohio region, and since 2017, internal combustion engine vehicles peaked and have been in permanent decline. Within the next 5 years, it's anticipated 10% of the new vehicle purchases will be electric vehicles. That number will continue to quickly grow as production capacity increases and we continue to see the price point drop. Furthermore, for the first time this year, long-range EV model leases with longer battery warranties and a lower price point are ending, making them available as used cars. Market and population growth will continue to put pressure on our infrastructure. The Central Ohio region is expected to reach 3 million people by 2050. To remain a Midwest leader in EV adoption, we very much support efforts by the City of Columbus to plan for the future with a responsible, equitable EV parking-ready policy that prioritizes close-to-home charging and an equitable distribution of charging access. The requirement of 5 to 10% of parking spaces having EV charging stations for construction of new buildings and parking lots tracks with the adoption rate we are currently seeing and prepares us for that future. By focusing on installation of EV charging during construction of new buildings or major renovations of parking areas, construction costs are reduced by up to 75% compared to retrofitting a parking lot or structure to put in EV charging stations, based on findings from cities that have enacted similar EV readiness ordinance across the country. Based on AEP Ohio's findings through the EV charging rebate program, EV charging project prices can vary depending on site location and application. An example, multi-unit dwelling versus workplace. Majority of charging stations funded through this program were also retrofitted added after property construction. These price points underpin the opportunity to further reduce the cost of installation by incorporating charging into original concept and construction on properties. This region knows how to prepare ourselves for growth in market demand. Through the Smart Columbus electrification program, we worked with over 70 site hosts to install workplace and multi-unit dwellings to install charging that is actively used today. For some locations, the demand may not be at capacity right now, but in 2 years it will be. This is about planning for the future and ensuring every resident has access to close-to-home charging, regardless of the socioeconomic makeup of the neighborhood. Therefore, we ask you to support and move forward the equitable EV parking-ready ordinance. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Meyer. Councilmember Dorans.
Thank you for your testimony. I think one of the really cool things about Smart Columbus has been over the years of looking across the world and finding what are other cities doing well and how can we incorporate that in more of a comprehensive way here in Columbus. And I just wanted to ask sort of broadly from Smart Columbus' perspective, if possible, like how does this stack up against what other communities have done over the past 5 years or so, or here recently, as folks are trying to figure out from a public standpoint, how do we encourage and sometimes require EV charging adoption to make sure that the infrastructure is ready for what we know is coming?
Well, we know that there are other cities in the United States that have higher installation rates, and I can get you those cities. I don't know them off the top of my head at the moment. So I think we come in like in the middle. And what we're seeing is, yes, obviously there is a lot more demand for EVs, and this tracks with what, we're seeing in the demand and does prepare us for the future. Certainly, we fall behind some other cities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have any questions myself, but appreciate the work that Smart Columbus has done and is still doing to this day, and certainly your input on this as we look at this important policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker tonight is Jamika Humphreys with Impact Community Action. Welcome to council. Look forward to your testimony.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Remy and Councilmember Dorans. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on Columbus's EV-ready parking ordinance. My name is Jamika Humphreys, and I am a community advocate at Impact Community Action. As a community advocate, I have the responsibility to identify social determinants of health, such as chemical pollution, air pollution, and climate change. It is my role to help reduce health disparities and enhance health equity. I'm here to express our strong support for Columbus's EV-ready parking ordinance. We support this policy because adoption of an equitable EV readiness ordinance is one of the most impactful climate and equity actions a city government can take, and the most cost-effective for developers to facilitate the adoption of electric vehicles and to enable increased access to lower cost and lower carbon transportation options. Adopting this EV-ready parking ordinance is a signal that Columbus is committed to equitable, cost-effective, and future-friendly solutions that improve the quality of life for our residents and help create a prosperous community for all. On behalf of Impact, I urge you to vote in favor of the Columbus EV-ready ordinance. This is a unique opportunity to address historical inequities and ensure that all members of our community have access to an electric vehicle future. Our communities deserve an opportunity to continue to thrive and drive electric. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your testimony this evening. All right, well, that's all we have from our guest speakers, but we do have 12 speakers signed up to speak in person or virtually. We've received 14 submissions of written testimony in addition to who we have speaking publicly tonight. So thank you to everyone who's taken the time to share their comments. First, we have Rabbi Abanar speaking virtually on WebEx. For the record, please state your name, your address, and any organization that you may present. You have 3 minutes to speak, and the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Great. Thank you, council members. I really appreciate the opportunity to testify today in support of the equitable EV parking ready ordinance. My name is Robbie Abanor, and I live at 1172 North New Hampshire Avenue in Los Angeles, California. I'm speaking to you today as a sustainable transportation strategist with the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC strongly supports this ordinance, which will make sustainable transportation more accessible to Columbus residents. Columbus is already a regional leader in EV adoption, and this ordinance will ensure that the city has the charging infrastructure necessary to continue its transition away from a fossil fuel-powered past and towards an electrified future. An EV in Ohio has half the carbon emissions of a gas car, so electrification is a key tool in the fight against climate change. We believe that EVs are the future of driving. They're better for the planet, better for the health of our communities, and cheaper for residents, especially as we're seeing gas hit $5 a gallon. And as more EVs enter the used market, the barriers to entry are falling. There's no question that EV adoption will continue to grow in Columbus, and the city needs infrastructure to accompany that growth. NRDC has helped cities across the country with EV readiness policies. This proposal is in line with national best practices, and we believe it will set the city up for success. Your staff has put a tremendous amount of thought and effort into this proposal. Their engagement with both low-income residents and the development community has created a plan that improves the lives of Columbus residents, protects the environment, and will work for development. Again, NRDC strongly supports this ordinance, and I thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony this evening. Our next speaker this evening is Jeffrey Brock, and welcome to the podium. You have 3 minutes. Please state your name, your address, and any organization that you may represent.
Thank you, Chairman Remy and Council Dorans. My name is Jeff Brock, and I live at 6161 Riverside, Columbus, Ohio. I'm the owner and managing partner of a company here in town, Heartland Charging Services. We're located here in Central Ohio, and we help public and private organizations all over the state of Ohio and in the Midwest navigate through their EV infrastructure strategies. As you can imagine, we're pretty busy right now. That said, the city of Columbus is a unique position to be the leader of the state and also in the Midwest in terms of how we're going to plan to address this very important topic that we're discussing today. As I stand here today, I'm in support of the Equitable EV Parking Ready Ordinance. And as I look to prepare some comments for this afternoon, I wanted to share some recent data that I pulled up this morning in review. Over the next 6 to 8 years, nationally, EV adoption is targeted to 25 to 30% of all vehicles on the road. Central Ohio lags behind that a little bit, but this is in support of all the auto manufacturers, as was presented earlier today. Ford, GM, Chrysler, they're all investing billions in capital to make the switch to transition into EV motor vehicles. A lot of that money is happening right here in the state of Ohio. You may or may not know the state of Ohio is the second largest job creator for automotive manufacturers in the country. Why is that important? We, as the capital city and the shining city here in the state of Ohio, have to lead with that effort. I think that's very important that we practice what we preach as it relates to sustainability and green initiatives. The Central Ohio economy is also continuing to grow. 3 million people projected as of 2050 that we just stated. A lot of that is contingent upon 80% of our travelers here in Central Ohio are one vehicle family, meaning there's not a lot of train rail system that happens between Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. So the economy would support vehicles in that sense. As we also noted, 50% of the community lives in multifamily type development. So that tends to drive the more concern around the variabilities of housing options and where we should be able to focus on bringing this up to that community. Equitable, diversity, inclusion, and those types of goals become very important with what we try to roll out. So in conclusion, I encourage the council members to support the Equitable EV Parking Ready Ordinance. I work with developers every day. I think this is very important to our city, and we need to continue to embrace this strategy. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your
Appreciate it.
testimony. Our next speaker is virtual John Melkai from the BIA. John, you have 3 minutes. If you could state your name, your address, and any organization.
John Melkai, Building Industry Association of Central Ohio, 445 Hutchinson Avenue, Suite 280, Columbus. Councilmember Remy, Councilmember Dorans, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on behalf of the residential construction industry. As you are aware, our region has been consistently underbuilt for 15 years, with last year showing a 2,000 unit decline in the construction of multifamily units in Central Ohio. Our members are working tirelessly to navigate labor shortfalls, supply chain challenges, increased lending costs, and ongoing delays related to the outdated nature of the city's zoning code, approval process, and related delays. We are fortunate the city is working to address the zoning code update. The work of council has been outstanding year to date, and the city's department heads, including those from Building and Zoning Services, Public Utilities, Parks and Rec, and Development, are working to improve processes in a way that might streamline the home building and development process within the city. However, the reality is that the cost of construction has risen by over 30% in the last year alone, with no sign of retraction. These costs and challenges make meeting the demand within our community difficult, which leads to the topic of this hearing and the potential policy implementation of a mandate regarding electrical vehicle wiring and charging stations. While we applaud and agree that energy conservation should be a goal for the city, lingering questions regarding this proposal and its potential impact upon housing creation and affordability put our industry in a position of being unable to support this policy in its current form. Make no mistake, the construction of new housing units provides residents with significantly more energy efficient and environmentally sustainable housing environment than an existing home. Builders are working regularly to improve the efficiency of their homes. Many have already put EV charging stations in existing developments, but nearly all who have done so have reported significantly less demand than originally imagined. The policy as drafted and proposed has many questions, including clear definitions of new construction versus retrofit. Assistant Director Celebrezzi did a good job of outlining potential challenges with mixed-use development. It is very hard for our industry to estimate the costs of this proposal without clear definitions. We would question the data and economic impact of the current proposal. Is it entirely accurate, and has it been properly vetted and confirmed in a way that can give council, the city, industry, and residents assurance that its numbers are correct? To the city's credit, they've continued to engage with industry on assessing cost, but there remains a significant gap in what had been originally proposed to the development community and what has been seen in real-world scenarios in Columbus. Third point is, are we sure that the technology being proposed today is the technology that will be widely used in a decade? Indiana and Michigan are both investing in wireless charging, and it could be premature to invest in infrastructure and a technology. While the category is clearly growing, we are unsure of what form will ultimately be widely adopted. We have heard from affordable housing developers that there are concerns that the mandate could impact tax credit financing. We believe it's an imperative that council have every clear data point in understanding the impact, good and bad, before considering legislation on this matter, and ask that the Department of Sustainability continue to work with industry to address costs related to implementation and ultimate viability. It's a very real possibility that the adoption of this policy could make development unable to be viable, and new units would simply not be constructed. At a minimum, a vote for this policy as constituted will be passed on to tenants and residents who may not realize the benefit for many years. Council alone will have to decide if the adoption of this policy in its current form is worth an increase in housing costs or ultimately contributing to homes not being constructed. We believe that more work needs to be done. We welcome involvement and continue to participate in such, but recommend that the city delay implementing any sort of policy until it's clear that all stakeholders have clearly communicated what the cost and implementation would be, so that we can craft a policy which achieves our goals of sustainability without inhibiting our ability to meet housing demands within the city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melkai. Our next speaker is Samaya Brooks, who is also virtual. If you could just state your name, what organization you represent, and you have 3 minutes.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Good afternoon, Councilmember Remy and Councilmember Dorans. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Samia Bray. I am the co-director of the Black Environmental Leaders Association. I reside at 6100 Richmond Road, Oakwood Village, Ohio, and I also serve along with David Wilson in the legacy of Jacqueline Gillen. I am here to express our strong support for the Columbus EV Ready Parking Ordinance. The Black Environmental Leaders Association theory of change is to advocate, incubate, and inform. We operate using a shared leadership model, and in this model, it involves maximizing all of the human resources within and empowering individuals. Our areas of focus include the built environment, energy waste reduction, green building and healthy homes, equitable clean energy, economic and workforce development, sustainable transportation, electric vehicles and e-mobility, and healthy neighborhoods to include land, air, and water. We support this policy because it will significantly increase the number of EV charging stations across Columbus and help ensure that residents in our low-income and Black and brown neighborhoods have access to EV technology. As with past technology advancements, like choice for broadband internet, communities of color have been historically excluded from these evolutions. With most major car manufacturers converting their vehicles, manufacturing line to all electric within the next few decades, we cannot afford to wait to install EV chargers in all of our communities, especially Columbus's opportunity neighborhoods. Standardized community-wide EV charging infrastructure will ensure equitable access to low-income communities, and we have the highest barrier to access EV charging and lower cost and lower carbon transportation options. Electric vehicles can be used to help lower household costs for our residents, but they will not buy an EV if they don't have access to charging them. Because 50% of our residents are renters without access to install an EV charger of their own, we need to have a city ordinance to intervene and ensure that newly built parking will include EV charging stations. On behalf of the Black Environmental Leaders Association, I urge you to vote in favor of the Columbus EV Ready Ordinance. This is a unique opportunity to address historical inequities and ensure that all members of our community have access to electric vehicle future. I thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bray. We appreciate your testimony. Our next speaker is here in chambers, Mr. Pat Hook, if you could come to the podium, and then Rebecca Molino after that.
Good evening. Chairman Remy, Councilman Dorans. My name is Patrick Hook. I'm the business manager and financial secretary. Let me give my address. Patrick Hook, 1445 Tanagra Way, Columbus, Ohio. And I represent the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 683. Located right here in Columbus, Ohio. My local union represents over 2,000 local residents that are employed in the construction industry as journeymen and apprentice electricians. IBW 683 and our signatory contractors invest over $3.5 million in apprenticeship training every single year to make sure that we have the highly skilled trade workforce to help build our community. Our members are the highest skilled electricians in Central Ohio because they graduate from a 5-year intensive apprenticeship program and have access to continued education on our new and emerging industries. I am here this afternoon to testify in favor of the City of Columbus passing legislation to require electronic vehicle parking infrastructure and new development in the city. We all know that the EV market is rapidly growing due to both the need for more environmentally friendly transportation options and, frankly, the cost of gas these days. However, we also know, as we know, it's been discussed here today, there is significant need for additional EV charging infrastructure to support and speed adoption of this new technology. IBW 683 is pleased that Columbus is taking steps to support the development of this key infrastructure. I believe that any legislation should include key training and labor standards to ensure that the work that results for these requirements is done right and safely. The electric work associated with EV charging requires having experienced electricians that have training in this specialization. This is not small, uncomplicated work. That is why we support including a requirement that contractors completing EV charging work under this legislation employ electricians that have gone through the nationally recognized Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program, also known as EVITP. EVITP is a nonprofit, volunteer-based, brand neutral, National EV Industry Collaborative Training Program that was launched at the University of Michigan. At least something good's coming from there. In 2012, EVITP addresses the technical requirements, safety imperatives, and performance integrity of industry partners and many stakeholders. The requirement of utilizing an EVITP trained workforce for EV charging infrastructure is supported by the U.S. Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation's memorandum issued on February 10th, 2022 on the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program guidance related to the allocation of federal funds from infrastructure law. The federal guidance recommends to ensure safety and high-quality delivery, each state plan should consider the training and experience level of the workforce that is installing and maintaining EV charging infrastructure. This includes ensuring the workforce is trained in training programs like the Electrical Vehicle Infrastructure Training Program. IBEW Local 683's Training Center is ready and willing to provide EVITP training to our members. Additionally, there are over a dozen signatory IBEW contractors in Central Ohio that are currently EVITP certified, and more are interested in implementing these training and safety standards if this type of requirement were implemented in this legislation before City Council. Implementing an EVITP requirement will help ensure this work is done safely and that the newly created charging infrastructure is of the highest quality to spur increased adoption of electric vehicles. The over 2,000 members of IBEW 683 that call Central Ohio home are ready and willing to be a key partner of the City of Columbus to help achieve the goals of this legislation. Thank you for this time this evening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Hook.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming down. And our next speaker is Rebecca Molino. You have 3 minutes. Please state your name, address, and any group you're associated with.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Remy and Councilmember Dorans. I'm Rebecca Molino at 6375 Riverside Drive in Dublin, and I work at the Nature Conservancy in Ohio as a Climate and Energy Policy Associate. Thank you for the opportunity to offer support for the City of Columbus's electric vehicle ready parking ordinance. The Nature Conservancy is a global organization with chapters in all 50 states and projects in over 70 countries. We are a nonpartisan, science-based organization that seeks to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We work collaboratively with businesses, farmers, sportsman groups, governments, and local communities to develop pragmatic solutions to conservation challenges, including land conservation, water quality, and climate change. To protect the land and nature that Ohioans love, and to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to reduce our carbon emissions. In the US, cars represent the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions, and encouraging the increased use of electric vehicles is one important step to reduce the impacts. Over the lifetime of an EV versus a gas engine vehicle, EVs have on average 1/3 the carbon footprint. This includes the production of the battery and accounting for the energy going into the grid to charge the vehicles. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in 2020, 24% of Ohio's energy consumption was from transportation. This essential sector is a significant contributor to carbon emissions, and we must move towards lower carbon options. Not only does the overall production of EVs have a smaller carbon footprint, but since EVs do not have tailpipe emissions, the benefit of cleaner air goes directly to the residents and the environment where EVs are driven. We already see the market shifting toward the goal of increased EV usage, including the recent announcement of the investment in the Ford plant in Northern Ohio. There are a number of efforts in the state of Ohio to increase the affordability and adoption rate of EVs, and addressing the charging infrastructure is essential. The proposed city ordinance by the City of Columbus is a significant step to facilitate the adoption rate we are currently seeing and to prepare us for the future. Adding charging infrastructure removes a major hurdle to adoption for those who live or work in Columbus, while also lowering vehicle emissions in our city and reducing air pollution. By including single-family homes, as well as multifamily and affordable housing, the accessibility of EVs will include more of our residents, including the most vulnerable to the impacts of poor air quality and climate change. By requiring installation of charging infrastructure at the time of construction, up to 75% of costs of a retrofit installation are saved, making it the most cost-effective and efficient time to install chargers. We need more EVs in the state of Ohio to reduce emissions, and encouraging adoption of EVs in the city of Columbus will help our local air quality. The EV-ready parking ordinance will move us one step closer to these goals and a better, cleaner future for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate that. Matthew Stevens Rich, you are up. Welcome you to the podium. Please state your name and the organization you represent and your address. Next up is Hallie Newhouse.
Thank you, council members, for the chance to offer testimony this evening. I'm Matt Stevens Rich, Senior Program Manager with the Electrification Coalition. I live at 2127 Steffi Drive in Hilliard, Ohio. Electrification Coalition is a nationally recognized, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on accelerating transportation electrification through stakeholder engagement, technical support, and direct implementation to deploy electric vehicles at a massive scale, combating national security, economic, and public health impacts associated with the nation's dependency on oil. The EC has direct experience working at local, state, and national level, such as through the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge, where we're a national implementation partner, and also served as lead implementation partner for the Smart Columbus program. I personally actually worked with the city staff on writing the grant for that, so came full circle. Today I come before you in support of the Equitable EV Parking Readiness Ordinance. EVs provide many benefits to consumers, economic development, and the environment across our region by producing fewer tailpipe emissions, as testified earlier, and also saving money at the pump. At current gasoline prices, up to $1,200 annually can be saved in driving an EV for the regular annual mileage for the average Columbus resident. As the EV market continues to expand, charging will become ever more paramount, especially for at-home access. Recent study by the 2022 J.D. Power Electric Vehicle Consideration Study, just released last week, has found that while cost concern has declined as a critical factor for potential EV buyers, access to charging has grown as a concern, registering with 34% of respondents, and is expected to continue increasing as well. Focusing on installation of EV charging during construction of new build or major renovations of parking areas helps really reduce construction costs by up to 75% compared to regular retrofitting or going back through during trenching and conduit. This is based on findings through other cities that have also enacted EV readiness ordinance across the country, which the EC has had chance to work with and support both through Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge and other programs. Above all else, we've seen similar opportunity to work with property owners and site hosts to incorporate these EV readiness elements, maximizing cost effectiveness of charging installation. There also remains the imperative for remedying environmental justice and redlining within our community to support a transition in low income to make sure residents have access to equitable and accessible EV charging, regardless of where they live in our region. What's more, the lower operational costs to EVs prove an opportunity for reducing the overall energy burden, that is, amount of income spent on energy for those most impacted. I encourage City Council members to support the Equitable EV Parking Ready Ordinance, helping the city further reach towards its own climate action plan goals, which benefit residents and tenants alike across the city. Thank you so much for the time to testify, and I appreciate your consideration.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony this evening. Our next speaker is Hallie Newhouse. Hallie, you have 3 minutes. Please state your name, address, and any organization that you represent. Greg Shack, you're next.
Good evening. My name is Hallie Newhouse, 3240 West Henderson Road in Columbus, and I'm here representing Clean Fuels Ohio. Good evening, Chair Remy, Councilmember Doran, Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Equity EV Parking Ready Ordinance. I'm the Policy and Government Affairs Manager for Clean Fuels Ohio. Our mission is to improve air quality and health, reduce environmental pollution, and strengthen Ohio's economy by increasing the use of cleaner domestic fuels and energy-saving vehicles while prioritizing both equity and economic benefits. Clean Fuels Ohio aims to ensure that the state is prepared for the transition toward electrification so that communities are not playing catch-up to meet the increased demand for EV chargers. This ordinance supports that goal by establishing EV readiness at the point of construction rather than retrofitting, which is far costlier and inconvenient to future EV owners. Lack of EV infrastructure is a primary deterrent cited by Ohioans, preventing them from purchasing an electric vehicle. This ordinance addresses this concern by assuring drivers that they will have sufficient access to charging throughout the city, thus serving as an incentive for Columbus residents to adopt EVs. This ordinance also helps fulfill another core tenet of Clean Fuels Ohio's mission, providing cleaner air for the citizens of Ohio. Because EVs produce fewer tailpipe emissions, everyone, and not just EV owners, can benefit from the ordinance's incentive for EV ownership. An ordinance like this is especially important for Columbus. Franklin County has the highest level of EV ownership in the state, and the city must make it a priority to encourage residents' choice to go electric. This will also ensure that Columbus continues to set an example to the rest of Ohio on how to embrace this EV wave and support citizens' mobility choices. While there is much to commend about this ordinance, we would like to ensure that it aligns with our core value of equity as well. The city has stated that the EVSE installed requirements for affordable housing are contingent on a city-funded program to cover the costs, and we'd like to see this funding guaranteed before the ordinance is approved to ensure that these communities are not left behind. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony this evening. Appreciate it. Greg Shack, you are up. JD Groves is next.
Good afternoon. Greg Shack on behalf of NAIOP, Central Ohio Chapter, Commercial Real Estate Development Association. 7385 State Route 3, Suite 52, Westerville, Ohio, 43082. Councilmember Remy, Councilmember Dorans, Deputy Director Celebrezzi, Chief Sustainability Officer Clark, and Climate Advisor Topaldi, thank you for the opportunity to present the testimony related to the EV Ready Ordinance. The over 200 members of NAIOP Central Ohio include many of the most respected developers and owners of commercial real estate throughout the city of Columbus, and numerous other commercial real estate professionals, including lawyers, brokers, engineers, architects, and title professionals. NAIOP has participated in the advisory group meetings related to the EV readiness program that the City of Columbus is considering implementing, and NAIOP has carefully reviewed and updated the proposed ordinance on the EV ready parking. NAIOP desires to be a resource for the city on this very important issue and to provide feedback and insight with respect to the Columbus Climate Action Plan, both now and in the future. NAIOP greatly appreciates the city updating and or amending the ordinance based on the public comments and feedback that the city received. While NAIOP understands the commendable purpose behind the EV readiness and is generally supportive of its implementation of some of the aspects of the EV ordinance, NAIOP has serious concerns related to the proposed new law's impact on NAIOP's membership and unintended consequences that could ultimately have a negative impact on the commercial real estate market in Columbus, its residents, and the businesses that work in the city. A few of the primary concerns are as follows. A real-world example, for illustration purposes, consider a new 200,000 square foot office building in downtown Columbus that requires 5 parking spaces per 100,000 square feet, or ultimately 1,000 parking spaces. Based on the current ordinance, 100 of those parking spaces would be required to be EVSE, so electric vehicle supply equipment, which would amount to a cost of approximately $500,000 based on the city's current estimates. NAIOP believes the city's estimates are below market. With that in consideration, an additional 300 spaces would also be required to be EV capable, costing an additional $100,000 based on the city's estimates for a total cost of $600,000. The cost for these additional improvements would be passed along to the business owners and potentially employees working at those offices. According to a February 22nd of 2022 Reuters article, less than 1% of the 250 million cars, SUVs, and light-duty trucks on the road today in the United States are electric. What happens if the demand for EV in the new parking lot is only 10 spaces out of the 100 EV SE spaces that are available? What is the owner supposed to do with 90 unused parking spaces? Can the owner park non-EV vehicles until the demand finally catches up with the supply? Who's going to enforce the rules related to the EV parking on private property? Will the enforcement rules be similar to that of a person illegally parking in a handicap space? Is it unrealistic that demand is going to increase tenfold in less than 18 months when the requirements become effective? Given the challenging cost environment, is right now the time to layer an additional cost burden for a requirement far beyond the existing market demand? It is unclear from the draft ordinance what would in fact constitute a newly constructed parking lot. Owners and developers need specificity with respect to the effective date and as to when the ordinance will actually give to a newly constructed parking lot. Does the ordinance govern when the owner applies for a building permit, when the use is approved, when the owner commences construction, or when the construction of the parking is completed? Also, mixed-use developments are not defined, so which category of the ordinance applies to this development? Multifamily, office, or the more general other commercial? The high costs associated with compliance will leave many owners of residential buildings, office buildings, warehouses, and retail centers unable to comply without passing the cost down to tenants, including those low-income communities that the ordinance specifically desires to protect. In a city where parking is in short supply, especially downtown and the urban core, the proposed ordinance will reduce the number of new parking spaces that are available to non-EV drivers and make it more expensive to park in downtown and around the city. Overall, green areas and the building square footage will be used for more additional parking spaces to accommodate the demand for non-EV vehicles. And does the city really want to make parking less affordable for its residents and workers, further incentivizing individuals to stay working from home? Further, the ordinance is too broad, compliance under the ordinance is too burdensome, and the affected types of buildings are too vast to implement. An ordinance that does not address complexities and market realities. The vast types of impacted building are split into only 5 categories. All other commercial.
I gotta ask you to. We can get the rest of your testimony of you.
Fundamentally, the EVSE installed minimum parking requirements, we request that it be phased in starting January of 2026, not 2024, and shall be based on market demand, based on studies leading up to those moments thereafter.
Councilmember Dorans.
Yeah, can I ask you a question about that phase-in? So talk to me about why that phase-in from 24 to 26 matters.
Yeah, absolutely. The key thing is that we understand and appreciate the EV-capable aspect of this, and that's the avoiding the cost of retrofitting. We're trying to limit the cost burden so that we know what market demand actually is. So if we have requests from tenants, as not me personally, but as developers, then you can build for demand based off of what was already created through the EV-capable subset. And then once you know what demand is, once you can do that market research, have the ordinance actually reflect what that growing demand is on a more understandable basis. Right now, there's a decent amount of projections with the numbers that we're working on that are, quite frankly, speculative until we see it start to trace out with a greater level of consistency. And when that becomes the case, then this can start to build on a more demand-driven cycle.
Thank you.
So,
Can I ask you a follow-up?
oh yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So
Go ahead.
When you make the statement, NAIOP says there's a shortage of parking downtown, what is that based on?
Yeah, so I'm a part of a work group within NAIOP, so I can't speak on behalf of developers. Just general sentiment, I believe, is where the basis is, and then looking on data and what they're seeing.
Okay, if NAIOP can provide something, in writing, data backing it up, I'd be interested to see that.
Anything following up related to answers in writing, I'll work with the work group.
Thank you.
And then, would it be fair to say, would NAIOP be supportive of providing EV-capable in construction starting in 2024 and then phasing in other aspects of it in 26? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I got to go back and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of any sort of written response from the work group, but my understanding is the comfort level around EV-capable is much higher. Like, people understand that this demand is out there, it's a much lower cost burden, it's the high burden that EV installed, especially at the percentages that are provided, that could potentially affect development opportunities.
I mean, that seems, I'd like to explore that a little bit further and ask the team to support that, look at that a little bit further as well. I mean, we know it's coming. We just don't know, about demand yet. But certainly as you look at the OEMs, there's a commitment, $20 billion commitment from GM and $11 billion commitment from Ford. So, it's going to be here. It's just a matter of when.
Right, and I think the idea is, time being money. The earlier that you install, if demand isn't meeting it, you're then taking away from other sources of use for that same parking until demand actually.
Yeah, and to the team too, I'm also curious about that question. Like if for instance there were 100 spots there, I don't think it's treated the same way as a handicap spot, but I want to be certain that isn't the intent of the committee. Go ahead, Councilmember Dorans.
So last question, I'm assuming this will be a follow-up, so I don't expect you to answer right now. But when you're using the example of a 200,000 square foot apartment or multi use building downtown or a commercial space, obviously folks within the industry are going to price that by square foot, so what the increased cost is. So I think it'd be helpful if that hasn't already been done from y'all's perspective to line that up with what folks internally at the city are saying. So if you're saying your increase from a dollar per square foot from a leasing standpoint is going to go up $1 or $2 or whatever that is, I think that would be helpful for council to see, because ultimately I know that's how you price leases, right? Is what is the square footage cost? And ultimately, when we're asking developers to do more, we know that there's going to be a realization of that cost as you pass that on. So I think from a council standpoint, I think that'd be helpful to hear from industry folks and compare that to what we're hearing internally.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and definitely a follow-up response.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Before I do catch the next speaker, I do want either Tony, do you have a response as far as the parking spots go? Like if
Correct. The current code as it exists already allows for spots that are restricted for EV charging to count towards the minimum number of parking spaces. So if you had to have 100 spaces based on the zoning code formulas for number of parking spaces to square foot, and you make 5 of those EV only, those still count towards your your minimum parking qualifications. So you wouldn't have to build 105. You would still just only have to build 100.
Was there any consideration to think about, like, if I put an EV spot in, that's worth 2 spots? In other words, some sort of a trade-off?
We were concerned with doing the 2-for-1 because of we don't have quite enough parking overall in the city, especially in the larger, more densely populated areas. And so we just felt that at least doing 1-for-1 did not impact the developer in any way, shape, or form as far as their minimum qualifications or the minimum numbers required. And to address a second point, with each different use is got a different formula per square footage for how many parking spaces are required. So once that overall number is determined by the zoning staff, and that's what they're going to build, that's what the EV charging formula is based upon. So it's based upon what your minimum required parking is based on your entire project. So even if it's mixed use or it's one use, you're going to end up with a minimum number of parking spaces any way you cut it, and then you would apply this formula to that.
I was thinking about those formulas and how they change, and how churches are grossly, they're hyperinflated, the number of requirements for churches, religious institutions. Do they fall under all other commercial? Would they be responsible as well? So if somebody's out there building a new church?
They would. They would have to comply depending upon the use, and churches will be a challenge because they are allowed in residential parcels. Churches have a lot of leeway into what zoning district they're allowed to be built in. But again, you're back to what is the minimum parking spaces that they're going to be required, and we also allow them to utilize other off-parcel parking spaces more readily than we would most uses, because we're looking at it from a standpoint of, generally speaking, their heavy uses on weekends, when, say, an office building next door may not have a large usage, so they may contract to utilize their parking space, their parking lot also. So,
if we were to pass these ordinances as presented or some variation thereof, would council still have the ability to grant a variance in the future due to hardship?
The parking variances run, because they're a design criteria, that is the Board of Zoning Adjustment hears those cases and grants those. And short of the Short North parking area, downtown area, and the East Franklinton, they have the authority to grant those variances to parking. Now, of course, whenever you all hear council variances and rezonings, if those design standards are rolled up into that rezoning, then that would fall under your purview, because we allow design standards to be rolled into a rezoning so that people don't have to go through two different processes.
Thank you. All right, J.D. Groves, you're up, and then finally we have Ebony Williams after that.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Chair Remy and Councilmember Dorans. It's good to be here today. I'd like to first thank you for the opportunity today to speak in favor of the EV ready parking ordinance. I'd also like to extend thanks to Deputy Director Celebrezzi and also the sustainability team, Brian and Jenna, and the team at Impact Community Action. My name is J.D. Groves, 292 South Royce Avenue. I am appearing today on behalf of Impact Community Action, and I am also formerly of the Greater Hilltop Area Commission, and I have significant experience in the electrical industry, 15 years worth. So today I'd like to speak to you directly about some of my experience over the past several weeks in which I have been working with the team at Impact Community Action to facilitate engagement in the community with regard to the proposed parking ordinance. And specifically with my background in the area commission, I deliberately targeted the area commissions to generate that feedback. So for the past several weeks, I've been visiting the area commissions, generating feedback, and we've got quite a bit of good feedback, and very happy about that experience. As I said, today I am appearing in favor of the ordinance, and similar to a couple of years ago when the city unified planning policies with C2P2. Likewise, the implementation of the electric vehicle charging station ordinance will kind of unify citywide policy that, we can find some equity there. I think it's the intent obviously is to have a blanket policy across the city so that we don't have lapses in infrastructure in socioeconomically distressed areas. Being from the Hilltop, that is something that I'm very familiar with, and typically we do see lags in infrastructure investment for one reason or another, and I can also see that across the city in socioeconomically distressed areas. So as I said, having a unified policy acts in a way to prevent that, and I think that that is definitely a good thing. Secondly, this would also fulfill several goals associated with the Envision Hilltop Plan, which was implemented also a year and a half ago pre-COVID. Seems like a lifetime since COVID. So as a part of that, the goals that would be fulfilled with the execution of this implementation of the policy, it would act to strengthen active and shared mobility across the Hilltop. In addition, we would also ensure that housing units meet the needs of occupants by adding EV ready to new builds in the area. And in terms of market rate family housing, this also provides an opportunity, not necessarily now. I think that a lot of the conversation that we've had centers around the fact that, if you allow the market to, if you allow the market to generate demand, to kind of frame exactly the implementation of the infrastructure, then organically, what we've seen in the past with regard to other investments of infrastructure is that you're going to continue to see the lagging behind of socioeconomically distressed areas. And for us, we feel that kicking the can down the road this is a great opportunity to make sure that that can doesn't get kicked down the road. Lastly, I would like to mention specifically some information that I've been given from the Greater Hilltop Area Commission as it relates to some interesting points that could be added in the future. And that is, in the interest of equitable implementation across the city, we've had conversations that implementing a per capita density requirement to make sure that we have an equal amount across the city is something that we've spoken candidly about. And also, in areas that may be saturated, implementing a sliding scale so that areas that are less saturated, we can have that implementation in areas that may not have that opportunity. And lastly, I just wanted to say 1891 was the last electric vehicle that we had on the hilltop, and that was the rail car, 1891. Currently, we have one public access charging station on the hilltop. We have one. So it's taken us 130 years to get even. So we're looking to push forward.
Point well taken.
And that's all I have. So if you folks had any questions, I'll be happy to have them.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your testimony this evening. Ebony Williams, last but not least, and by the way, you are the 11th speaker. I misspoke earlier and said there were 12. So, Ms. Williams, it is your turn if you're here.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Councilmember Remy and Councilmember Dorans. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the Columbus EV Ready Parking Ordinance. My name is Ebony Williams, and I'm an energy advocate at Impact Community Action at 711 Southwood. I have been an energy advocate for 3 years. I have listened to our low-income communities and our needs, and I'm here to express our strong support for Columbus EV Ready Parking Ordinance. We support this policy because it provides a brighter future for our children. It's not always just about us in the need for right now. We need to think ahead for the future. With gas prices just being at an all-time high that I've ever seen in my lifetime, everyone is looking for the better option and opportunities. So we're looking for ways to save, and this is definitely one of those ways that we can save. We are, with EV sales, with EV electric car sales, they have grew 67% since 2020. So since from 2020 to 2021. Now, I know you think that many people in the community may not be able to afford an electric car at this time, but just like any other product that is being continued to be made and duplicated and reinvented, it's going to be soon, the market is going to be flooded with these electric cars, which will decrease the price, which will open up more opportunities for people to buy these cars. Just this last year alone, there has been over 20 new electric cars that came out this year. Now, as the cars are being built, they're going to need workers to build the cars. So it's not only just giving us a better quality of life, but it's also creating jobs for us, where we are going to be building these cars, building these charging stations all over the city. It's going to equal out to better, higher paying jobs. And it will be focusing on the installation of these chargers during the construction for like the new builds or major renovations for these parking areas, which will reduce the cost by 75%, which is also saving the person who's building it, but also saving the community. This policy has adopted the no man left behind motto. because it understands that we need these EV charging stations all over the city, especially in the low income neighborhoods, which too many times we get left behind. And I'm just happy, that they are making this presentation for us to not be left behind. So by having more EV charging stations, it's more likely a chance that someone will buy an electric car because these things are available for them to charge the car, which means lower emissions and pollutions from us, which is definitely a great thing because it will promote better health in our communities, cleaner air and cleaner water, which will give us a huge impact on a climate action plan. So on behalf of Impact Community Action, I do urge for you to vote in favor for the Columbus EV Ordinance. This is a unique opportunity to address historical inequalities and ensure that all members of the community have access to electric. I think that's my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your testimony this evening. I do believe that we have a representative from OEC here who did present testimony written, but I'll allow them the opportunity to speak briefly. Thank you.
Councilmember Remy Dorans as well. Thank you all for the opportunity today. My name is Dion Mensa, 1145 Chesapeake Avenue, Suite I, Columbus, Ohio, and I'm the OEC's Energy Justice Fellow. We're here to testify in support of the ordinance today. While having expanded access to charging is a critical step in advancing EV adoption, there are also major obstacles to accessing EVs themselves that may limit residents' engagement with the newly available chargers. In other words, how will residents truly feel the benefits of increased chargers across the city when they don't even have access to electric vehicles to begin with? It is important that the city considers the ways that households are grappling with increased costs of living across the board, including skyrocketed costs of gas, now reaching almost $5 a gallon in Franklin County. In doing so, we encourage the city to work to find ways to alleviate the burden in promoting the transition to EVs. Thus, it is critical that this expansion is implemented in an equitable fashion that takes into account the needs of all residents and neighborhoods across the city. To ensure this, there's a need for programs and/or funds supportive of those who have been historically under-resourced and excluded from the transition to clean energy economy. Examples include group purchasing programs and rebates for used EVs. In a survey conducted by Clean Fuels Ohio, it was found that 42% of survey respondents named the initial cost of EVs as a chief concern and hesitation to adoption. We urge the city to continue to evaluate the ways that future efforts could address and lessen existing economic disparities in EV adoption and charger access. Thank you all for holding this public hearing to provide additional opportunity for input from our Columbus community, and we at the OEC Action Fund look forward to working with you to support equitable access to EVs and to advance the city's overarching climate action plan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Appreciate it this evening. So thank you, everyone, for sharing this evening. It's been a real pleasure to get this information, certainly for my colleagues to be able to hear the testimony. I want to thank my Councilmember co-host Rob Dorans for being here this evening, and the rest will certainly catch up via virtually and recorded message. Our next steps include making any final revisions to the legislation before it comes before Columbus City Council for a vote in the following weeks. Please reach out to Sustainable Columbus team or my office if you want follow-up from this hearing. Jenna, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
Email or phone line. Feel free. Myself, Brian, and Tony, all of our phone lines and inboxes are open.
What's the website again, just for public record?
The EV Ready Parking website is the Sustainable Columbus website, so it's columbus.gov/sustainable/EV Ready Parking, and our contact information, my email address, as well as Brian and Tony's, are listed on that website.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to end this hearing by thanking our presenters and the folks who have moved forward with the electric vehicle ready parking work for the city. Jenna Topoldi, Brian Clark, and Tony Celebrezzi. Thank you to each of our guests and public speakers for participating this afternoon. Thank you to the various council staffers, especially my assistant Lucy Frank, for helping coordinate today's public hearing and for staying plugged in to the electric vehicle ready parking conversations. Thank you to Mark Carter and the entire CTV team for their assistance in making sure this hybrid committee hearing took place today. Have a great evening, everyone.